7. Rare WWII tanks you've never seen before. 7 tanks. Almost no photographs. No parades, no victory murals, no legends built around them. Yet, in the middle of the Second World War, these machines existed for one reason only: to solve problems that frontline crews were dying from in real time. Rare, in this context, doesn't mean collectible. It means urgent, experimental, and often inconvenient to remember. Here's the promise of this video. We're not counting museum curiosities or paper projects that never left a drawing board. This is a corrective catalog. 7 tanks that sat at the edge of doctrine and production, built to answer specific battlefield failures when existing designs stopped working. The contrast is clear: legend versus reality, fame versus influence. One cold report captures the idea. A single after-action note from a battered unit describes shells bouncing harmlessly off enemy armor at point-blank range. Within weeks, a prototype was rushed into trials, ungainly and unfinished, but armed to answer that exact failure. It never became famous. It didn't need to. What matters here isn't how many were built. It's what these tanks tried to fix. Conflict and stakes. Scope criteria. Why this matters. Before we go any further, we need to draw hard boundaries. This isn't a list of failed fantasies or every obscure chassis ever welded together. It's a catalog built on intent, pressure, and outcome. Because without criteria, rare becomes meaningless. First, rarity here is defined by reality, not hype. Low production numbers matter, but so does exposure. Some of these tanks saw combat in handfuls, others barely made it beyond trials, yet directly influenced what came next. Second, this list spans multiple nations and theaters, because rarity isn't a German-only story, nor a late war one. Third, each vehicle had clear doctrinal ambition, a problem it was designed to solve, whether that was breaking fortified lines, surviving new anti-tank guns, or restoring firepower parity. This is where the central tension lives: innovation versus adoption. Wartime necessity pushes engineers forward, but feasibility pulls production back. A design can be sound and still fail if it arrives too late, demands materials that no longer exist, or requires crews that can't be trained fast enough. Planned numbers tell one story. Built numbers tell another. Deployed numbers tell the truth. On paper, some of these tanks were meant to appear by the hundreds. In reality, they emerged by the dozen, or not at all. Strategic bombing, shifting priorities, and collapsing supply chains quietly killed more designs than enemy fire ever did. Understanding these machines matters because they reveal how wars actually adapt, not through legends, but through constrained choices under pressure. These tanks expose decisions commanders and engineers made when there were no safe options left remaining. Core Block 1. Early war experiments, firepower versus mobility. We've just set the boundaries, what counts, and why rarity matters. Now we move to the first wave of answers, the tanks conceived before the war's feedback loop turned brutal and unforgiving. Early war rare tanks are defined by optimism. They were designed in a moment when doctrine still imagined clean breakthroughs, deliberate advances, and tanks performing multiple roles at once. Firepower was prioritized to smash defenses. Mobility was assumed to follow. On drawing boards and test tracks, these machines promised decisive force. On campaign, their weaknesses surfaced fast. Many of these designs chased conceptual ambition, multiple turrets to engage infantry and armor simultaneously, oversized guns mounted on chassis never meant to carry them, or armor schemes that looked impressive but strained suspensions and transmissions. The contrast here is firepower versus mobility, but more precisely theory versus endurance. Weight crept upward faster than engines improved, and crews were asked to manage complex machines with limited visibility, poor ergonomics, and constant mechanical stress. A single early campaign trial captures the pattern. One prototype, officially designated differently depending on whether you consult factory paperwork, Army trial logs, or post-war historians, performed well in static tests. Its gun met expectations. Its armor resisted known threats. Then it was ordered to advance with a formation for a full day. By mid-afternoon, overheating forced repeated halts. Steering clutches wore down. A breakdown stranded it on a road it was meant to dominate. On paper, it solved a problem. In motion, it created new ones. This wasn't incompetence. It was timing. Pre-1942 battlefields punished weight and complexity mercilessly. Early war engines lacked the power-to-weight ratios designers assumed they'd soon have. Gearboxes and suspensions were pushed beyond tolerances. Crew workload ballooned as commanders were expected to direct movement, spot targets, and manage secondary weapons simultaneously. Infantry support tanks from this period illustrate the trade-off clearly. Built to advance slowly under fire, they carried thick armor and large-caliber guns, but their limited speed and reliability made them liabilities once fronts became fluid. Breakthrough tanks promised shock and momentum, yet struggled to exploit success because they couldn't keep up once lines collapsed. Even logistics amplified the problem, as recovery vehicles and spare parts were rarely available in sufficient numbers. Commanders noticed. Reports from 1940 and 1941 repeatedly stressed the same issues, promising vehicles sidelined not by enemy fire, but by fatigue, maintenance hours, and crew exhaustion. These documents rarely condemned the designs outright. Instead, they ask quieter questions about sustainability under real combat tempo. One quick accuracy note matters here. Many of these vehicles appear under multiple names in books and online, prototype numbers, pilot model labels, or retrospective service designations. For clarity, what matters is not the name, but the configuration tested and the role it was meant to fill at the time. These early war experiments weren't dead ends, they were stress tests. Every failure fed lessons forward about crew layout, power requirements, and the cost of asking one tank to do everything. And as the war accelerated, those lessons would be applied under far harsher constraints, with much less room for optimism left, shaping what followed next in armored warfare history across nations and doctrines. Core Block 2. Mid-War Adaptations, Protection versus Production. We've moved from optimism to urgency. By the middle years of the war, tanks were no longer speculative answers to theoretical problems. They were emergency responses to threats already tearing through formations. Mid-war rare tanks are defined by collision, survivability versus manufacturability. Enemy anti-tank guns had grown deadlier, battlefield intelligence traveled faster, and losses mounted too quickly to ignore. Designers responded the only way they could: thicker armor, larger guns, lower silhouettes, and simplified roles. Many of these vehicles began life as stopgaps. Up-armored variants rushed into service, assault guns stretched into tank roles, or heavy designs authorized in limited numbers to plug sudden capability gaps. On paper, some of these machines worked. Protection increased. Firepower finally overmatched common threats. Crews reported improved confidence under fire, but production told a harsher story. Extra armor demanded steel that was already rationed. New guns required retooling lines that were barely keeping up with existing output. Even minor design changes cascaded into delays across factories and depots. One technically sound design illustrates the trap. Trials confirmed it could survive hits that destroyed earlier models, and its gun performed exactly as intended. The plan called for hundreds. In practice, a single specialized component, requiring skilled machining and long lead times, slowed assembly to a crawl. Bombing disruptions and priority shifts finished the job. The design wasn't rejected. It was simply outpaced by events. This is where rarity becomes strategic, not accidental. Commanders faced impossible choices. Do you accept a tougher tank that arrives too late, or a weaker one that shows up now? Survivability versus production wasn't an abstract debate. It decided which units re-equipped and which went back into combat underprotected. Assault guns converted into tank substitutes show this clearly. They were cheaper, lower, and faster to build, but lacked turrets and flexibility. Heavy tanks offered battlefield dominance in narrow roles, but strained transport networks and fuel supplies. Each solution solved one problem while creating another. Here's the question mid-war planners wrestled with, and one we'll pause on briefly. If you were responsible for the front, would you choose thicker armor with limited numbers or faster production with higher losses? That trade-off shaped every rare tank in this period. These adaptations weren't failures. They were compromises under pressure, revealing how industrial limits, not imagination, increasingly dictated what could actually reach the battlefield as the war ground on relentlessly. Core Block 3. Late War Extremes, Power versus Practicality. We're now at the war's breaking point, where design stopped chasing balance and started chasing advantage at any cost. Late war, rare tanks represent extremes, machines conceived under bombardment, shrinking resources, and collapsing timelines. The contrast shifts again: intimidation versus usability. These vehicles were meant to dominate psychologically and physically, projecting power far beyond their numbers, even as their practical value narrowed with every added ton and component in service conditions that no longer rewarded complexity or theoretical perfection. By 1944 and 1945, the battlefield punished excess ruthlessly. Oversized guns promised knockout blows at extreme range, but demanded enormous turrets, reinforced hulls, and specialized ammunition. Experimental suspensions aimed to tame unprecedented weight, while radical silhouettes attempted to cheat physics through intimidation alone. The contrast here is theoretical dominance versus operational reality, because every engineering victory arrived chained to new failures. Fuel consumption, transport limits, and crew training all lagged far behind ambition during final months of conflict. A late-war test illustrates the problem cleanly. During controlled trials, one such tank delivered undeniable firepower, destroying hardened targets that earlier designs simply could not touch. Observers recorded impressive penetration and shock effect. Then came mobility trials. Breakdowns followed within hours, recovery assets were unavailable, and fuel demands exceeded what frontline units could realistically supply. On a fluid battlefield, raw power meant little once the vehicle stopped moving entirely under combat pressure and constant withdrawal conditions everywhere. These machines often looked unbeatable in photographs and reports, which is where myth took hold. Propaganda emphasized armor thickness, gun caliber, and isolated test results, rarely mentioning reliability or logistical burden. The contrast of intimidation versus usability widened as training shortened and experienced crews vanished. A tank that demanded careful handling became a liability when crews had weeks, not months, to prepare. In practice, intimidation faded quickly once maintenance hours eclipsed combat availability across collapsing fronts everywhere late. Accuracy matters here. Some late-war tanks are remembered as unstoppable monsters, but documented performance is narrower than legend suggests. Test conditions favored ideal circumstances, not mud, shortages, or constant retreat. Separating verified trial data from wartime claims reveals machines that excelled briefly in specific roles, before their costs outweighed their contributions. They were engineering achievements constrained by reality, not secret weapons capable of reversal despite popular depictions and simplified post-war storytelling in popular media circles. In the end, late-war extremes reveal desperation more than dominance. Power without practicality could not change outcomes when fuel, crews, and time were gone. These tanks closed the door on experimentation, proving limits as clearly as possibilities. And with that realization, armored design turned away from excess toward survivable balance under peacetime realities. Their legacy lies not in what they won, but in what they warned against as the war finally ground to a halt across continents globally. What these tanks reveal. Taken together, these 7 tanks don't represent curiosities or mistakes. They mark transitions, ideas tested under fire, measured against reality, and deliberately set aside. That's the final contrast. Remembered legends versus forgotten lessons. History celebrates vehicles that arrived in numbers and stayed in service. It forgets the ones that revealed limits early, quietly shaping what came next. For historians, these machines expose decision-making under pressure. For modelers, they capture moments where design briefly diverged before snapping back to practicality. For designers, they remain warnings about weight, complexity, and timing. Rarity here isn't failure, it's evidence of evaluation. If you want to continue this catalog, tell us where to go next. Another set of rare tanks? A deep dive into obscure WWII aircraft that never reached squadrons? Or canceled armored programs that died on the factory floor? Drop your pick below and we'll keep mapping the roads. Armored warfare didn't take forward.